Hey, this tutorial is brought to you by pm-prep35.com. We are a online PMP training website. Do visit pm-prep35.com to access a lot of free resources in terms of mock exams and chapter tests and tutorials. In this session, I'm going to cover the first of the project scope management process called as plan scope management process. This is a planning process and it involves the creation of the scope management plan and the requirement management plan. So the plans, these two plans or the subsidiary plans of the project management plan, which is the master plan. So you create all the subsidiary plans based on what is there initially in the project management plan. So how the subsidiary plans and the subsidiary plans normally get detailed as more information is available. So initially there is very less information in the form of one-liners in the project management plan. As you get more information about the scope, the requirements as well as the cost and all that, your plans also get more detailed. That's where you separate it out into a separate plan in case of each of the subsidiary plans. So the plan scope management process gains more weightage as you get more details about the requirements. So you start from what you have written in the project management plan and go into more details in the specific document called as the scope management plan or the requirement management plan. So the scope management plan mainly has details about the different processes, how those different processes will be handled. For example, in case of project scope management, the different processes are define scope, create WBS, validate scope and control scope. So you're mainly concerned about detailing each of these process. So you write about how you will create the scope statement, how will you build the WBS, what will be the structure of the WBS, how will you break down your scope statement into more detailed level in the form of WBS, how will you validate or formalize the acceptance of the deliverables once you have completed all the work. So each of these is a different process, and what tools they will use, what process they will follow, what methodology will be involved, when will each of these process happen in different phases or in the project life cycle. So all these get detailed in the scope management plan. So the scope management plan is understandably very specific to the scope as such, and when you talk about requirement management plan, you're talking about detailing the requirements. How would you build the requirement traceability matrix which will trace the requirements across different project phases. So each of these plans, be it scope or requirement or for that matter any of the knowledge area plans, they are more concerned about what are the different processes in that particular knowledge area that will be used, that will be tailored for this particular project, what tools and techniques will be used, how things will be handled, who will be reviewing it, who will be doing what at what point of the project and things like that. So with that background, so we need to understand that the project, the scope management plan or any subsidiary plan gets detailed starting from one-liners in the project management plan. And because scope is one of the first processes to be planned, because scope, time and cost are called as the triple constraints, so these need to be under control or planned initially, and they are one of the first processes to be hit. So that's where the project charter, which has all the high level details, becomes very vital input in case of many of the planning process, that to specifically scope, time and cost. So project charter will have the high level scope or the high level boundaries or the product acceptance criteria, the product acceptance criteria, then high level project scope, everything at a high level. So project scope, product scope will all be part of your project charters. That's where your project charter is really vital. Your project management plan will tell you how you will detail scope or different subsidiary plans, but the project charter has more specific details about what is required, what is the scope, what are the inclusions, what are the exclusions, so that you can plan for it in a detailed level in case of the scope management plan. So with that background, we'll just look at some of the important points about this particular process. Plan scope management process deals with the creation of scope management plan. It also deals with the creation of the requirement management plan. So the requirement management plan can be used, it is used to create the requirement documentation. The requirement documentation collects all the requirements, but then when you get to the define scope process, you take only you form a boundary around all those requirements, and you just define what would be the specific scope for this particular project, although many requirements have been gathered as part of the collect requirements process. So the requirement management plan is more concerned about requirement documentation and requirement traceability, how we will do it, but the scope management plan is more concerned about how we will define scope from your requirement documentation, and also from after you create a scope statement, after defining the scope, how will you break down that scope into more detailed level, how will you make it a work breakdown structure. So that's what is the idea of create WBS process, and details about how to do these processes will be covered in the scope management plan. Scope management plan involves the process of defining the scope, validating and controlling project scope. Validation is more concerned about formal acceptance, which just happens before closure, project closure. And you have control scope, which is done as part of the monitoring and controlling process, wherein you keep monitoring on your weekly meetings or on a day-to-day basis how things are progressing, and if there is any deviation, you're on top of it. You ensure that corrective action, preventive action, or any sort of defect repair should be done if it is to be done in the form of raising a change request. So that's all part of control scope process. Proper scope planning process helps in negating scope creep. Scope creep is anything that you do outside what has been agreed with the customer or outside the boundaries. If you enter into the exclusions part, or you go outside what is included in the outside what is included in the boundaries, then it's called as scope creep. If you're trying to do more than what has been accepted or written in the scope statement or in the baseline documents like scope statement, scope baseline, which is scope statement, WBS and WBS dictionary put together, these three things are called as scope baseline. If you do anything out of it in the form of pleasing the customer, then it is called as gold plating, and that is also considered as scope creep. It's not considered to be satisfying the customer, but then you're going out of the way or going out of scope. So that's why it's scope creep. So the main inputs for this particular process, the project management plan, this is a very vital input, at least in the initial iterations, basically because the project management plan has a plan of how we will detail the different knowledge area plans. So that way the scope management plan, how to build the scope management plan, is also part of the project management plan. But then once you have sufficient details, your project management plan is more like a guideline to build the scope management plan. So once you have sufficient details, then you build the scope management plan, which again gets integrated in the project management plan as a subsidiary plan. So that's why project management plan is one of the vital inputs. Then comes the project charter, because it has the high level details about what are the boundaries, what are the inclusions, what are the exclusions, what is the product acceptance criteria. So when you talk about project scope is also included in it, because you are talking about product acceptance criteria, because the project is all about building the end product or the service or result, so that you can't escape that when you talk about project scope. So your project charter details all this, so you look up to this and then you build your scope management plan accordingly. The other main inputs are the enterprise environment factor and the organizational process assets. Understandably, the enterprise environmental factors is all the outside link or the external link that the project might have, which can influence the scope management planning process. So that's why you need to take care of organization culture, organization structure. So all these might add to the time that might be required to build the scope, or how you do the scope planning or create WBS processes. The organizational process assets might have lessons learned from previous projects which you might want to use. You might want to use the templates that you use for previous projects for the same client or similar clients. So you might want to reuse the same thing for your scope management plan template. So that way the enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets are very key inputs and a common input across all the planning process. Especially enterprise environmental factors will be a very key input across all the planning processes. So with this, so you have 4 inputs. First one is the project charter, the second one is project management plan, the third one is enterprise environmental factors, the fourth one is organization process assets. The tools and techniques, understandably, because you are in the planning phase, you spend a lot of time on meetings, meeting up with different stakeholders, meeting up with other managers who had experience in this particular area, or consultants if you don't at all have any exposure in this particular area where you're trying to build the scope, or for the project for which you're trying to build the scope management plan. Expert judgment, because planning needs a lot of inputs from experts. So when you have meetings, you mostly have expert judgment involved, because people from different subject matter experts get involved in this process. So the outputs from this process are scope management plan, which has details about how scope will be detailed, what are the different processes you'll be following, what would be tailored, how will you do scope definition, how would you do break down the work. So all these details, what are the tools and techniques you'd use for the specific project. Then the requirement management plan has details about how would you document the requirements, what would be the format of your requirement traceability matrix. With this background, we'll quickly look at a couple of templates that I picked up from the web. So this one is requirement management plan. So when you look at the requirement management plan, it has details about the requirement management overview, organization responsibilities and interfaces or the contents. Then you have tools, environment and infrastructure. Then you have, in case of requirement management, you might have some assumptions and constraints, you might document it. Then about the requirement definition process, how will you do it. Then you have requirement traceability, what is the structure for the requirement traceability, how will you do the documentation. Any change management related aspects also become part of the requirement management plan. So requirement management plan approval, so that also is one of the sections in the requirement management plan. If you get to the scope management plan, the scope management plan understandably will have details about different processes within the scope. So it would have details about how will you define the scope statement, how will you define the WBS. So collect requirements process will go into the requirement management plan. Anything apart from that, which is used to define the scope and create a WBS, will all be part of how will you do all these things, what tools and techniques will you use, when will you do these, will be part of your scope management plan. So it will have details about scope management approach, responsibilities and roles, scope definition process, project scope statement, product scope description, deliverables, scope acceptance criteria, scope exclusions. The process for building all this, process to do this will all be part of the scope management plan. So again, the WBS, how do you create the WBS, what format would you use, scope control, how would you do scope control, who will do it, when will you do it, in what intervals will you do it, will all be part of this section about scope control within scope management plan. So that's about the plan scope management process, which deals with creation of requirement management plan and scope management plan. Understandably, these just create the plan for these for this particular knowledge area. The knowledge area again deals with scope as well as requirement management. So it's not about creating the scope statement, but then planning how to do it. What is the process you will follow? What is the methodology? What are the tools and techniques? How will you get approvals and details about that? So actual job of creating the scope statement will be covered in defined scope. That's a different process. So that's about plan scope management process. Do visit pm-prep35.com to find a lot of free resources and mock exams. Thank you.